She let out a deranged laugh as she'd realized that she'd been reincarnated as Ariel Winston, the antagonist of her favorite novel, May Rest Be at Your Side, which she was fated to die at the beginning of the novel. At the age of 23, she'd lost her life to an incurable disease after 5 years of battle. However, Ariel was written as a genius perfumer, and that was due to the scent of Anyxia, the demonic flower, which the male protagonist, Cedric Evans, had requested that she create into a perfume. However, she decided to toy with the male lead by threatening Cedric into dating her before she handed over the perfume. Their superficial dating wasn't enough for Ariel, and soon she began to crave real affection from Cedric, but he'd already begun to despise her. That was where the female lead comes in to soothe Cedric, and he'd accepted her love, which Ariel despised. Her obsession with Cedric grew to an almost dangerous level, and so she'd attempted to assassinate the female protagonist with a perfume, but her plan failed miserably, and thereafter she was executed for murder. But this was the second life that she'd never hoped to have, and so she decided to remove all death flags on her path of happiness. And the first step to this was to break off her engagement with Cedric Evans. She'd sat across from him, and with vivid cerise-colored eyes, paired with his plum-colored hair, so dark it almost looked black, Ariel understood her obsession. But today, she'd break up with this beautiful man, and with a bow, she apologized profusely for her past behavior, and now that she'd felt different, she no longer saw the need to maintain their relationship any longer. She got up and promised to send the requested Anyxia perfume through another, as they'd no longer have any contact with each other. He needed the perfume to control his animal urges, and she said as much as she called him a rabid beast, but soon apologized for the slip of the tongue as she'd realized she'd said that to his face. And with one last polite smile, she'd left the restaurant, leaving behind a completely baffled-looking Cedric. And now that she'd no longer meet Cedric, she removed her death flag. She burst through the doors, giddy at the thought of not dying. But soon she was faced with another challenge, as upon her return home she'd come face to face with her stern-looking father, and she bowed in greeting. But soon he shouted, spittle hitting her face upon hearing that she'd met with Cedric. He scolded her about her improper behavior as well as the fall of House Winston's reputation since. He'd also told her that Cedric Evans wouldn't give her the time of day no matter how hard she tried. But the old man's jaw almost fell off with how fast it fell open as she'd told him about their mutual breakup. Her father concluded that she'd been thrown away, but she'd stated that the breakup was her decision because she'd no longer had feelings for him, and her father worried that Ariel had contracted a deadly disease that led to her uncharacteristic behavior, and ordered the maid, Lena, to check her condition. But she assured the man she was fine and soon requested leave. She walked on her merry way as her father tumbled back and soon lost consciousness due to the shock. And with how tired she was, Ariel knew that there was one more task she needed to complete, and so she'd made her way to her perfumery room. And upon entering the room, she gazed in awe at its grandness. She basked in the array of scents that permeated the air around her, and when she sniffed at a particularly deep rose scent, she'd almost wailed, for when she'd been sick in her previous life, she'd lost all her senses. And to smell again was something she'd never dreamed she'd be able to do once again. She'd wanted to be a perfumer before her illness had confined her to a bed, and while she'd had some talent in academics, she'd aimed for the chemistry department. But that was all dashed away with the arrival of her incurable disease. But now she'd had a chance to do what she'd always wanted, but a thought occurred to her, and she looked around, and upon opening one of the drawers, she'd found the little notebook. The notebook contained Ariel's perfume recipes, and soon she'd come across the recipe for the scented perfume that the novel Ariel had used to kill the female protagonist. And on the page after, she'd found a recipe for a love perfume, and Ariel was sure novel Ariel had attempted to use it on Cedric, but she flipped through the book until she'd found the recipe she'd wanted, and that was for the Anyxia perfume. Anyxia was a rare demonic flower that could only be found on the eastern continent, as it was there that the gate to the demon realm had once resided. The flower was so rare that it was sought by even the highest of monarchies, and this scent was also the cure to Cedric's madness. He'd once cut off its use, and that had resulted in many deaths after. A maid knocked on the door, informing her that a guest from the Evans estate had arrived, and the man appeared to be Cedric's aide. He bowed respectfully in greeting, and he apologized for the late visit. He'd, however, been requested by the Duke to return an item she'd left behind at the restaurant, and upon opening the little box, she discovered the corsage she'd worn earlier. She'd found it odd that Cedric had returned this to her considering his indifferent attitude towards others, but she'd thanked the aide nonetheless. He smiled in acceptance, but soon moved the conversation to the festival that would soon be held in the Michelin district the next weekend. They expected the streets to be very crowded, and thus they would send a carriage to escort her. But Ariel grew quite confused, for why would she need his grace's escorting? The aide explained that she'd usually insisted on outings with his lord, but Ariel interrupted him as she explained with a beaming grin that they'd broken up earlier today, so there would be no need to see him during her weekends anymore. The aide looked confounded by her words as he questioned, "And so you have no intention of taking it back?" To which she'd firmly stated that she'd had none. But soon she questioned if it was permissible to send the Onyxia perfume to the Duke's estate, and the aide wondered if she'd deliver it in person. But Ariel stated that there were many horsemen and servants for that job, so she needn't bother. After concluding their business, he bowed once again with an apology for disrupting her night and left. She watched the Duke's carriage as it left their estate, and after a moment, she handed the corsage to the maid, and she ordered, "Throw it away." Back at the Duke's estate, his aide announced his return from the Winston estate. The aide grew quite nervous under the weighty stare of Cedric, and after a moment stated, she did not look a single bit regretful, and therefore, he concluded the breakup to be official and not a ploy for attention. He recalled Lady Ariel's extremely chipper attitude, which he'd made sure not to mention to the Duke. Cedric scoffed at her sudden change in attitude, and he wondered if he was to merely just go along with her whims. He'd found her behavior quite strange since usually he'd been met with a pout about his late arrival, nor had she stared at him with expectation. And the fact that she'd broken up with him when she'd forcibly remained by his side for the past year perturbed him to say the least, and he was sure she'd had a reason for breaking their courtship. Rikayon suggested that perhaps she'd been wronged in some way, but Cedric stated that he'd only been late by 10 minutes. However, Rikayon stated that, any way you looked at it, this situation was beneficial to the Duke since he'd held no feelings for Lady Ariel to begin with. And while they'd broken off their courtship, she'd promised to continue supplying them with the Onyxia perfume. But Cedric held on to his suspicions that the lady had something up her sleeve. He tapped his finger on the table thoughtfully, but paused when his aide theorized that maybe Ariel Winston had fallen out of love with him. He knew that his aide's words were sensible and that this situation benefited him the most, but he couldn't shake his feeling of distaste about it all. He thought perhaps it was the air, and soon he ordered Rikayon to get maids to air the room out. The aide ran off to do as the Duke commanded, and once alone, he threw his glasses onto the table with a heavy sigh. So engrossed with the notebook that she'd found, Ariel had remained in the perfumery for the last 4 days. Memories she'd buried deep inside due to her illness began to resurface, and so she'd spent many days creating new scents with vigor. And at last, she'd created a perfume with various hints of lemon, roses, and lavender. Ariel had many recipes listed in her notebook that could be used for specific purposes, such as a scent used to treat inner wounds or a scent used for attraction. But this time, she'd created a perfume used to ward against fatigue. But after spritzing some into the air, she wondered why it had no effect on her. Lena wanted to partake in Ariel's activities, and after spraying some of the perfume towards Lena, she went into overdrive. A rush of energy overcame her, and soon she blazed with the need to fulfill her tasks. Ariel realized that she'd need to reconsider the ratio of the product to Lena, which was said to boost energy. But Ariel soon discovered that she was in dire need for more raw materials, and Lena recalled a store Ariel usually purchased from, and that was found in the Senin district. And soon Ariel stepped out of the carriage with enthusiasm, and after visiting the flower store, she'd pranced down the street arms full of flowers. A lady bumped into her, and she tumbled to the ground, flowers scattered all around her. A snarky voice spoke up as she'd remarked about the flowers being too little to grab Lord Cedric's attention, and she looked up to see a trio of mean girls as they smirked down at her. She spoke in a haughty tone as she'd mentioned that she'd heard in passing that Ariel had been stood up once again, and by now Ariel had realized that these girls had pushed her down on purpose, and as Lena helped her to her feet, she smiled as she stated that the lady didn't need to worry so much about her since she and the Duke had broken off their courtship. They cackled as they'd assumed Cedric to be the initiator of the breakup, and they feigned empathy for Ariel that diverged to an insult as they'd wondered who would accept a woman that had been infatuated with a man for over a year. But their hopes of shattering Ariel's self-esteem were dashed away as she let loose a grin as she'd stated that it was natural for women and men to grow apart, and with a smile, she wondered aloud if they questioned Lord Cedric's value now that she'd cast him aside. But the lady pointed her fan at Ariel as she angrily denied Ariel leaving the Duke, and that she shouldn't tell lies since this could affect her future prospects for marriage. But she'd only smiled as she wondered if the lady would introduce her to a nice young lord since she'd worried for Ariel's future. And so she explained her preference for more rounded and cute men to that of sharp-looking men like the Duke. The lady trembled with fury as she realized that Ariel took her for a fool, but Ariel played dumb. And with a mighty twirl, she stomped away. She smiled, having achieved her goal of aggravating the petty lady. Rikayon walked in with a smile as he stated they'd received a parcel from Lady Ariel, and upon discovering the Anyxia perfume inside, he realized she'd been true to her word. With a push, he urged his aide to leave, but Rikayon insisted they test the perfume first, as she'd sent awful perfumes disguised as the Anyxia perfume in her previous package. But Cedric ignored him and sprayed the perfume into the air, a feeling of relief coursing through his body. He admired her talent as a perfumist since many others failed to achieve what she did. Rickon pulled him from his thoughts as he unwrapped one more box, which held another perfume. Cedric read the little note attached, which stated that this one relieved fatigue. He wondered if this was all a ploy to get his attention once more, but after spraying into the air and feeling none of its effects, he sprayed it towards Rikayon. The aide zoomed past Cedric, ready to complete his afternoon duties, feeling invigorated once more, and Cedric understood that she'd sent this perfume with no ill intentions. Back at the perfumery, Ariel held the same perfume, having some left over, and she looked at the recipe in the notebook, sure that it could sell for more than 1,000 gold coins, but a knock on the door alerted her to the maid, and she informed Ariel that her father awaited her presence in the dining hall. And upon entering, he ordered Ariel to sit as he had a few words for her. He steepled his fingers together and, with a heavy voice, stated, "You need to get married." He explained that a marriage proposal had arrived since rumors that the Duke and Ariel had broken off their relationship. The second son of Marquis Marcel had taken an interest in Ariel. They were famous for their trades abroad, and he'd now found it a good time to create a connection with the prestigious house. But Ariel didn't want to accept and follow the standard principle of nobility now that she'd finally had a chance at life again. And to add, she'd have to marry a man she'd never met. But her father commented that the young lord was quite handsome with a good physique, and Ariel felt swayed for a moment by that information. Her father walked out, the conversation at its end, but Ariel stated that she'd not want to get married yet since she'd wanted to enjoy her freedom for a while longer. With a reluctant sigh, her father offered to grant her one wish, and Ariel's eyes blazed with delight as she'd stated without hesitation, "Raise my allowance for this month." Her father stared for a moment before he shook his head, noting that she'd gone back to doing her strange hobby. Ariel wasn't offended by his words, and her father offered her a large sum on the condition that she met the young lord, and she agreed readily. The man's name was Robin Marcel, and as she looked around the restaurant for the men in question, she wondered why she'd forgotten about his character until now. Upon finding him, she seated herself before taking a good look at the man, and she'd recalled that he was a side character that had drugged the female lead's drink before his attempted kidnapping. He aimed a repulsive smile in her direction, and she wondered if she should make a run for it before she remembered the large sum of money she'd made this sacrifice for, and that kept her rooted in her seat. But she soon became nauseated as the man radiated a foul aroma. And after sharing her thoughts, he sat back as he wondered if he should have a word with the manager, as he'd gotten a whiff of it too. She pulled out the perfume and sprayed it in the man's face, and it caught him off guard. He sat in a daze for a moment before he bounced up with life once again. He leaned in closer as he wondered if she'd sprayed him with an aphrodisiac, and Ariel paled at his words. The perfume was nothing but a refresher of sorts, but she'd heard that people under the influence of drugs were quite sensitive to scents and took them indifferently. He grabbed her arm, and he commended her boldness, and while other men would shy away from it, he'd accepted her seduction. Ariel, having no patience left, ordered the man to release her, but he smiled, sure she was just playing coy. His stench drifted towards her, and she was sure it was the residual smell of the drugs he'd consumed. He pulled her along, ready to take their meeting to the next stage, and she shouted for the waiter to alert the guards about this man's audacious behavior. He placed her hand on his chest as he asked, "Do you feel this?" "My heart is beating for you," and Ariel grew more disgusted the longer she stayed in contact with the man. He assured the waiter that Ariel played the role of a coy maiden, and once again she shouted for the man to let her go. But just as they'd reached the door, Cedric stepped in. He took in the scene before him, eyes that grew darker with every second. He grabbed Robin by the arm as he demanded, "What's going on here?" Robin trembled at the sight of Cedric Evans. He repeated the question once again, his voice dark, and Robin stated that he'd been out on a date with Lady Ariel. He gazed at Ariel for a moment, his eyes gentle before they hardened once again as he trained them onto the foolish man before him. He smacked the man's hand away as he stated, "You must be out of your mind." He grabbed Ariel by the hand gently, and he lifted it up for inspection. And upon seeing the state of her injured wrist, he questioned what she'd like to be done. He grabbed his sword as he suggested that they wound the man in the same place, and Robin dropped to his knees as he begged for mercy. He apologized for tugging on the lady's wrist while she refused, but he claimed that Ariel's refusal was nothing but a performance. Ariel scolded the man as she told him that she'd stated multiple times for him to let her go. With the tip of his boots, Cedric pushed the man down, and soon he let his weight drop as he stepped on the man's shoulder. He commented about Robin's lack of education as he stomped harder, and Robin shouted out in distress. Cedric ordered the guards to drag him away, and then turned to Ariel as he wondered why she was there. And when she asked the same of him, he answered that he'd come on business. He questioned why she'd have dinner with such a man, and she nervously looked away as she stated it was on the request of her father. She thanked the Duke with a bashful smile for his help, but Cedric wasn't done with her. He mused that she'd been out here planning her future with another man after she'd declared their breakup with him, which was a relationship that had lasted over a year, barely a week ago. He stated that there were steps and manners to uphold in such situations, but his words confused her. She questioned if she should have declined the meeting of new men for a while as she'd considered his situation and closure on their lost relationship. He confirmed her words, but Ariel was certain their relationship was extremely unpleasant for him, and his eyes narrowed at her words. She realized that while their relationship was one of a contractual nature, to the public, they were famous and acknowledged as merely lovers, even more so due to Cedric Evans' reputation. And with her meeting of new men so soon after their breakup, they would be the latest capital gossip. She bowed in apology at having failed to realize his position. But she looked up baffled as he questioned, "How long have you been thinking of dating me with no intention of marriage?" But she stated ruefully that she'd known since the beginning that she'd never hold the title of Duchess Evans. But he mused that she'd enjoyed being called Lady Evans with her social circles, and she looked away in embarrassment as she labeled it as nothing but a childish tantrum. His red eyes bore into her as he questioned if what she wanted remained the same, and Ariel stated with a bright smile, "Yes." He accepted her words with a bow and thanked her for all her help, and she mirrored his actions. He walked away before he stopped once more to note how helpful the perfume she'd sent had been to his aid and his productivity levels. And with those parting words, he left. And she turned and walked away, a small smile playing on her lips, success at having cleanly broken off her relationship with the male protagonist. But she soon had another headache to deal with upon her arrival at her home, and that was her father. He burst out in fury as he'd received a letter from the Marquis estate stating that Robin Marcel was held up in jail. He'd dragged her to his chambers, and it was there that he'd questioned why Robin Marcel was in a prison cell. She'd explained that he'd only been thrown in a jail cell to pay for his crimes, and her father scoffed, doubting that the man had had a sword fight with a couple of guards in a restaurant. She stated that while it wasn't as serious as that, he'd made some insulting remarks against her. He'd claimed she'd sprayed an aphrodisiac on him, and her father popped a fuse once again as he wondered just how she had carried herself to have been misjudged so poorly. Ariel stated that she'd only sprayed some perfume because the man stank, but the old man paid her no mind as he fussed over what gossip this would rake in, sure that she wouldn't receive any marriage proposals once word got around. He ordered her to issue an apology once she bailed Robin out, but she refused since she'd had no authority in that regard, as she explained that the arrest was made by Lord Cedric Evans himself. And like a switch, the old man changed his attitude in an instant, stating that they surely couldn't interfere if the Lord was involved. Assuming their conversation to be done, she turned to leave, but the old man opened his trap once again and said that he would find her new marriage prospects before rumors about the incident circulated, and Ariel looked at the old fart in horror. Luckily, he'd reserved a marriage proposal sent by Marquis Algin, and when apprehension arose, Ariel requested the Lord's age. He beamed as he stated that it was 40, a normal age gap by nobility standards, but Ariel was far from happy with this information. In fact, she looked about ready to commit murder, but she gained control of her almost broken sanity and, with a deep sigh, noted that he'd just wanted to sell her off to a rich man, and he didn't refute her words. But Ariel wouldn't accept this without a fight, and with a controlled smile, she took the letter from her father and crushed it as she told him that while she'd consider a marriage with a young and handsome man, she'd had no thoughts on marrying some geezer, equally as old as him. And with a confident grin, she expressed that she'd make up for his losses herself, but her father scoffed, for Ariel had not a cent to her name, so how could she pay him back? She knew that while she didn't have skills in swordsmanship or mana control, she'd mastered the art of perfumery, a talent not to be scoffed at. And the first order of business was to establish a store. But her confidence soon plummeted deep into the earth when she inquired from the flower shop owner about the cost of a store. He explained that the real estate in the Senan district was rather expensive, and she balked when he'd offered to introduce her to an agent. She grasped Lena by the shoulders as she questioned what one would do if they'd required money urgently, and Lena smartly suggested borrowing it. But Ariel knew she'd had no friends that she could borrow a large sum from. The flower shop owner interrupted their conversation with a stellar idea about finding an investor. He explained that he'd already known of her identity as well as about her perfumery skills. Lena and the owner chattered away about Ariel's notable skills and renowned name in the capital, and this boosted Ariel's confidence in securing an investor. She shook the owner's hand vigorously in thanks, and she trotted off, Lena trailing behind her, for she knew exactly where to find an investor for her business.